Hello. Thank you for letting me connect with you on this platform. My name is Chandan Kundapur, and I currently work as a senior product manager for Amazon Web Services. I have been a product manager for close to 7 odd years now. I initially started as an associate PM with Intel. Intel had a division called Intel Security, which used to focus on cybersecurity. And then they eventually spun off the division and it became McAfee all over again. But yeah, when I started my role, I started as an associate PM, primarily focusing on the SMB business. And then I quickly graduated onto managing their enterprise product line as well. I have managed the enterprise security product, which arguably has the largest footprint in terms of enterprise products. And as may be evident from the line of companies that you see here, I've primarily been in the cybersecurity domain. And that does hold true for my current AWS role as well. I do want to call out just a quick legal disclaimer that I'm here on a personal capacity and I don't represent either AWS or any of the other companies that I used to work for previously. I would love to get some more feedback from you about this presentation, what you like, what you didn't. If there are questions that I could answer for you, you can find me both on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. The topic was the importance of using data and how you can use data to better yourself as a product manager. And that's what I'm going to discuss here. This deck is primarily targeted towards those who are aspiring product managers who are looking at a career change, or those who have just started in their product management journey, maybe a couple of years in, and they're trying to get their feet around the rope over here. I know that this topic is extremely widely discussed, right? So I did not want to include in information that you may be able to just get off the internet. What I have done though is I've gone in and I've tried to get case studies from my experience over the past 8 odd years, uh, without, of course, divulging any of the confidential information around this. And I hope you find this useful. Now, information and data, I know it's a very broad term, so let me quickly scope down exactly what I'm referring to over here. It's essentially any information that helps you make better product decision. Now, this can be both quantified and qualified. For example, this may be product metrics that you're getting, which map back to the business metrics that you have, or this may be based on customer conversation that you had with a specific set of customers. This might even be from information that you get from, say, an analyst report, for example. Any data is always useful, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to restrict myself to number three, which mainly deals with product metrics that you may be getting either through product telemetry that you already have in place or through any other means that you have to get the typical product metrics. Now, each one of this topic on its own could be a session. So I will be brushing only on the high level of each one of these topics as I move forward. Now, why do we need to use data? I think we all know the age old adage that you can't really improve what you can't measure, right? And what you're truly trying to improve over here is your product roadmap. And product roadmap is honestly a very valuable resource for you because you have finite execution capability and you're trying to get in feature items which provide the most value for your customers. And these feature items are always vying with inputs with regard to one another. You may have 20 items on the roadmap, but you can only get in three out, for example, this year. And you need to make sure that you choose the three which provides the maximum value for your customers. Now, when you finalize this product roadmap or when you're prioritizing the product roadmap, you can be sure that you get opinion from every stakeholder that you have, right? And I will list out some of the influential opinion makers whom you will have to discuss this roadmap items with and where data would be extremely useful. The first one is, of course, what's usually known as an hippo, which is the opinion of the highest paid person within your organization. This could be your boss, this could be your boss's boss, or this could be someone really influential within the organization and who has a significant say on the roadmap itself. And when you have an opinion coming from such an individual, you can be sure that you can't counter that with an opinion of your own, because when there is a conflict of such opinions, it's a given that the opinion of the person with highest influence is going to prevail. The only way you can counter this is by using real data to counter your arguments. Now, that still doesn't mean that you'll get through with what you want to do, but it's the only way that you'll at least get heard and not get neglected completely. The second one is data or opinions that you're going to get from a lot of divisions. Now, for any complex product, we know for sure that there is going to be more than one teams that are going to be involved. Definitely more than just your team, right? There could be dependent product teams that contribute towards your product. There's definitely going to be cross-functional team in any large organization. For example, you will have support team telling you what the next fire is within the product that needs to be put out. You may have sales team which will come to you and tell you that unless you provide this feature, you won't be able to get the next multi-million dollar deal, and subsequently you won't be able to hit the revenue targets. And of course, you will have customers success team. You may even have a legal and compliance team, for example, coming through and telling you, unless you make this change, you may not be able to ship your product next year due to legal reasons. Whatever be the reason, it's a given that you're going to have to deal with a number of teams, number of conflicting priorities, and then you'll have to make a decision based on all of the opinions that you get, which are definitely going to conflict with each other more often than not. And finally, data is extremely useful, especially data as a product metric when you're trying to fight your own bias. This is something I used to do when I started off as a product manager, which is I would think I knew exactly what all my customers wanted just because I spoke with few of the customers. I did not recognize the fact that I was getting biased in either by the most valuable customer that I spoke with, or maybe by the loudest customer I spoke with, and that had an influence on the roadmap. Whereas what you ideally need is you need to look at the data, you need to back it up with what you hear from your customer discussions, but then you need to make a database decision to make sure that the roadmap is actually something that would be of most use to to the largest customer base that you have, and not just for the 2 3 customers that you speak with. So data definitely helps you unbias yourself to some extent if you just step back and start looking at the data in that manner. One other thing to watch out for is when product managers look at data, they look at data at a very high level and then tend to make decisions off it. At a minimum, please try to dive deep and understand the context around this. Let me give you an example around this. I was roped into end of life a product because the VP looked at the adoption numbers and it was very evident that the product wasn't doing good in terms of adoption. If you look at this year one, the product had around 10 million instances of install, very widely used, and then customers started abandoning it in droves. Right, year two it came back, it came down by around to around 8 million, maybe 7.5, and then by 4 million it's almost negligible. By fourth year it's almost negligible compared to where it originally was. For a VP, it's a very easy decision to make on this, which is to say customers don't need this. That's why they're abandoning this. Discard the product. Now, I had an hypothesis which said that the product itself was useful. It was solving a need that the customers had, but the customers were unable to use the product because of quality issues. Every time they would install the product, for example, the product would crash, or it would blue screen their machine, or it would cause one of their other applications to not function. So the pain that this product was causing was a lot more than the pain that it was solving. And that's the reason customers were abandoning this. But again, that's my opinion. That's my hypothesis at this stage. I can't just take my opinion and fight the VP with it. What you have to do is you have to prove your hypothesis based on data. How did I do this? I went and looked at support data over time and whether support data correlates with the drop that we see. And it evidently did. If I would draw another line graph, I would see that there was an increased number of support calls every time we saw an increased drop as well, indicating that customers were dropping this due to quality issues. Also, what was very evident that customers were interested in this data because customers were downloading this product every time we released a new version. Now, this was evident when I look at the downloaded instances, but then customers were not able to install this because install would cause them quality issues all over the place. So the distinction that I could make between downloaded data and installed data could tell me that customers are interested, but customers are not able to use this. I also looked at qualitative feedback from customers, and I asked them, if I was to make this one, two, three quality changes, would you actually adopt this? And I asked this from the largest customers we had, and the answer was an overwhelming yes. And finally, I also looked at competitive analysis to understand what are the competitors doing on this field. And it was evident that a large number of well-respected competitors were also investing very heavily in this technology, which indicated that there is a market demand for this. All of this is data that then I was able to compile together, take it to the VP, and make a proposal that we should not be disinvesting engineering on this, but rather we should be ramping up our engineering investment into this. But a very good example that tells you, when you look at this on face value, the data may indicate something, which in this case was that customers are not interested in this product. But once you dive in deeper, data will be able to actually surface you the truth based on which you can take actions. The second mistake that I usually see PMs do is not segmenting the metrics enough. Now, don't get me wrong, product managers do an extremely good job of segmenting their user base, their market, when they're building data, when they're making business cases. But once the product is out there, and once you start analyzing your product metrics, they don't always do a good enough job of segmenting it to understand how the product metrics map to their various segments. So this was another case study wherein we had an extremely large enterprise product, 100K customer, millions and millions of instances installed, and we had a new version out there. It had been almost 12 months and it had seen extremely low usage. The benchmark that we had was we should have seen at least 50% usage, but we were seeing only 10% adoption in terms of customer adoption of the product. Marketing, of course, thought this was an communication problem, and then they started communicating this extremely aggressively to all of these customers, telling them this new version is available, what's the value that it provides, and why they need to adopt this. The campaign was very extensive, but then it did not really translate into results for us. We were still seeing extremely low adoption even an year down the lane afterwards. This was when I got roped in to understand, to see what's going on here and how can we improve the adoption metrics. And what I quickly found out was they were looking at the 100K customers as one user segment, as one blob of data, whereas they should have fragmented this further based on the usage that we see. And we had four primary uh, segments here. One of them was SME, second is commercial, third is enterprise, and then we had one giant of a customer who formed around 10% of all of the end nodes or the revenue that we had. Now, interestingly enough, all of the SME customers who include customers with 1 to 10 end nodes had already adopted this product. So all of the adoption numbers that we saw were coming from these SME customers. But also, interestingly enough, these were the only customers who were getting the communication campaign. The reason this happens is SME customers used our product either directly or through an IT vendor, both of whom were very diligent to act on top of the email that they were getting because they were the direct consumers of the product right there. Whereas what was happening with commercial and enterprise customer was that the email campaign was going either to their finance department who had signed the deal with us or to an CXO level who did not really care about the emails that were coming through, and they were either ignoring the email or just deleting it. So this is the emails did not actually reach the end personas it was supposed to reach. This made it very evident that the communication campaign wasn't useful, right? Because the emails were reaching out to SME customers who already have a upgraded product, and it's not reaching out to the other segments that we have. So we had to format the communication campaign differently and have targeted campaigns for commercial and enterprise customer. And of course, we also had to build in a lot more feature tools so that we can help these commercial and enterprise customers test out the product and then adopt it subsequently. This was a huge success, but then a very good case study that tells you when you start looking at your customers as a single segment, especially when you're looking at product metrics, it can give you an extremely biased data, and your actions based on the data would be extremely biased and essentially not useful in many cases. Third thing, third thing to watch out for is the actual sanity of the data that you're getting itself. uh, as a product manager, you make decisions based on data, and then there is an assumption that the data that you get is good. But be aware that this may not always be the case. Let me walk you through examples. In Twitter, this showed up as a topic that I need to follow. Now, without looking at the category technology itself, I looked at the tweet. It said something about real estate in San Francisco. I said, not interested. I said, stop recommending this. Now, I wasn't aware of this, but the lady Jana Doggan, she is an extremely popular and tech evangelist. She's a rock star by all means, and I should have actually followed this topic to have followed her. But then I did not know this at that time. I thought this is about real estate, and if I follow this tweet and the topic, this might give me more real estate stuff, which I was not interested in. The second tweet that showed up as a recommendation had to do with Bumble IPO. Now, I am a huge fan of the Bumble CEO. Again, I think she's a rock star with what she's doing, and definitely wanted to follow her news topic that show up on Twitter. But then, if I had to do that, I had to follow the topic which this fell under, which was dating, which really wasn't the right category for me. But you can see how Twitter now has a convoluted impression about me, which is the fact that I don't like technology and the fact that I like dating, which is probably the exact inverted opinion of what they should have instead. Same thing holds true in many other social media platforms as well, right? Facebook had the like thumbs up button initially, and that was the only one that's available for a long, long time, which said you either liked or disliked the data. And that was very constraining by any stretch. They added a number of other remote icons, but still the content could be confusing. And the same thing holds true for, say, YouTube as well. Let me walk you through an example. This showed up on my YouTube feed wherein an Los Angeles restaurant was being scammed, where the customers through apps such as Uber, DoorDash, Postmate, and others, they would order food, but a couple of days later, they would either dispute the food through the app or else through their credit card providers, and the restaurant was thus facing huge financial challenges, and the restaurant had to close down. Now, I like the fact that this showed up in my feed, and I was able to learn about this. I learned something new that this was happening. This is something that has a huge social impact, right? So it's definitely useful for me. I can't like this because the topic essentially says that the restaurant had to close down because of this scheme, and I can't like this because liking this would mean I like this heading. I don't like what's happening, although I like knowing about this. And if I dislike this, then YouTube will stop recommending stuff like this to me, whereas I want to learn more about this. So the like and the dislike button was extremely limiting. I ended up not liking it, not disliking this. Now, what does this tell YouTube? That I, as a viewer, looked at this and I was neutral to this, whereas I was not neutral to this. I hate the fact that this is happening, but I would like to see more such videos show up on my feed. Simply no way to let YouTube know about this. Just an example as to how the data that you may be getting could be not telling you the whole story when you look at it. And of course, this is not constrained to just YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, right? This happens all the time. If I can give you a real world example, in the enterprise product that I used to manage, I was looking at the major call drivers that I had, and I observed that install was a large call driver. Almost over 50% of all support calls that were coming in were from install. And I wanted to understand what's happening because honestly, install was supposed to be transparent and seamless to the customer. The whole idea was there's a new version that's available. Customers say, yes, I want this new version, and the new version gets installed. It was supposed to be that transparent to the customers. So when I dug deeper, I understood that the calls were not even installed calls. What was happening was we had an tier 1 support which was handling the incoming calls from customers. Support was evaluated based on their time to close the ticket, and what they would do is if customers call in with queries that was not categorized very well, support would have to categorize it, and they would have to take in extensive notes as to what that category was. That could take anything from 1 to 5 minutes for them, and those minutes were critical because that would mean they were not able to close that call until the duration, and that would adversely impact their time to closure. So what support, or at least many in support, did was they would just drop down the existing categories, and they would randomly choose something and put the call under that category. It just so happened that when they dropped down the list, install was in a position that was most accessible for them, and many within support ended up hitting install for any of these other category that was showing up. So not all of them were install issues, but they were being categorized as install issues simply because install was the easiest one that they could choose to categorize this. If I was to make a decision based solely on the fact that install has more than 50% call volume, I would have prioritized my roadmap around install, whereas install truly had just around 5% of the call volumes, and they were much larger pain points for the customers that we had to address. A classic example of how data gets poisoned by the time you look at it, and how when something does not seem right, when something is an outliner, when something is intuitively not right, you just need to dig deeper to understand what's happening so that you know that you're making decisions based off the right data and not the wrong data. One other thing to watch out for is in terms of how the metrics get reported itself. Uh, Now, there are common metrics that are applicable across most of the products, right? And product managers make the mistake of assuming that some metrics hold true for all domain and all products. A good example of this is when I was working with my friend who had a site that he was running. One of the metric that he was measuring was user retention, which for me made no sense because the site that he had was a dating site wherein people could log in and they could find other people to date with. User retention essentially means that you want users to stay or to be retained as long as possible across that application or the site. And the whole concept of a dating site is when somebody logs in, he's hopefully able to find someone else of interest as soon as possible. So a larger user retention isn't very useful. Maybe he should be looking at user retention, but looking at uh, making sure that this number is as small as possible, whereas he was looking to make sure that this number was as large as possible. And this is a mistake that happens all the time. Just because user retention is a benchmark that sounds like it's something people need to measure, they think it needs to be applicable across all domain, all products. Never the case. Make sure that the metrics are customized exactly to whatever your needs are for your product, for your domain, for your industry. The other challenge that I see has to do with value metrics, and this is becoming more common nowadays. So, value metric has to do with how a metric maps back to an business value that you have. If you take an social media site as an example, right? A social media site, say it wants to spread positivity as much as possible. Positivity is an extremely difficult metric to measure. Is it based on the number of likes? Because and toxic content could still be getting a large number of likes. Or is it based on the number of shares? Because a toxic content could be getting a large number of shares. Usually, there is extremely complex logic that goes into this, which talks about, say, the user interaction with the content, who posted the content, who is sharing the content, the sentiment analysis of the content itself, the number of likes it gets, the number of dislikes it gets, the number of times it gets shared. But essentially, they look at a lot of context behind the content, and then they say, yeah, this looks to be positive, and what we want to be doing is to be sharing as much positive content out there as possible. It's a very good value metric for a social media site by any stretch. What I see happen nowadays, though, is just because a value metric needs to be there, people put in fake value metrics or pretend value metrics that should never have been there in the first place. One such metric that I saw previously was around smiles per device sold. This was for an hardware device company, and the company was selling a device that was around $2,500 to $3,000 each. Now, typically, you would want to measure that by number of devices sold simply, maybe the channels through which the device got sold, geography through which the device got sold. For example, if you're trying to understand where it's getting sold the most, but smiles per device simply made no sense over there. The only reason it got put in is because an executive said, I need a value metric. And the product manager working on this thought, if you need value, then I need to make this slightly more intangible and put in smiles per device rather than what would have made more sense to have over there. So please watch out for this. Don't make sure that the metrics are customized for your product. And second, you don't have a metric just for the sake of it, but then that the metric makes sense over there. And other challenge that I see is having metrics and especially having ratios just to make oneself look like it's of value, but it really serves no purpose over there. This was an article that showed up in Business Standard, right? And for anyone who may not be aware, India was impacted pretty heavily by coronavirus last year. Uh, but in India, did an exceptionally good job in being able to rein in the COVID infections. And honestly, for the population density within India, both the number of COVID cases per 100 and the deaths per 100 is exceptionally small. So India's done an extremely good job. And then, of course, the vaccination started. And once India started vaccinating, you can see this article here. This says 32.61% of its total caseload. What the article is trying to say is, of all the COVID cases that came that India has reported, 32.61 have been vaccinated. Now, what does this mean? Is this a number or a ratio that first we should be putting any importance towards? I don't think so, because what this suggests is we are currently at 32.61%, and if we somehow say reach 100%, which indicates 100% of all caseload number that India has seen gets vaccinated, then does India not worry about COVID? Again, this number or that ratio over there really has no value. It's been put in simply for the sake of sounding smart, and this happens more often than I can recall. Really, a ratio is supposed to bring out an insight that the metric is not able to offer you immediately. It should provide you that insight and tell you what's happening and what decision needs to be made of it. And if that ratio does not tell you that, just don't put the ratio just for the sake that it looks good. Please be very cognizant of every metric that goes in, and especially every ratio that goes in off that metric. And finally, as with any good PM, sorry, know when to stop. And this holds true across your product management life cycle, right? Not just for metrics and data, but definitely for metric. Where I've seen PMs do a mistake is they drill deep and deep and deep, and they keep getting deep, even though stopping at one layer or two layer would have been sufficient. If I go back to the first example that I had with regard to the product that was getting abandoned by customers, started with 10 million, came all the way down to 1 million within 4 years. I had data from my analysis to show that if we do quality improvements, then the product will see adoption again. Customers will find the value in it. But in spite of that, the VP said, no, we are killing the product. And that's what we went with. I could have dug deeper, provided more data, but it really would have changed that opinion, because the VP, for reasons apart from the product itself, just wanted to kill that specific product. So you should know when to stop looking or digging deeper into data, because after a given stage, more data will not really help your case. Now we looked at how to look at data, things to watch out for, and how to make decisions based off data. Now let's look at two other use cases, which is how to use data to report back to your boss or up the hierarchy change, and also how to have discussions with engineering. When you're reporting data to your boss, please make sure that it's in a format that's easily understandable. you get all the insights out to them and you don't let them do the math, and then it's very intuitive as to what needs to be done next. This is an extremely poor example of an product update, right? Wherein you say a product was launched last week and we have good feedback. Very vague. What does good feedback mean? I don't really know. Slightly better, but still bad, is this was launched last week and we have 10 users with good feedback. Now, is 10 users good? Was it supposed to be a million? Or is 10 users extremely bad? What was the benchmark number? I have no idea by just looking at this. And again, I don't know what good feedback means. This is a slightly better iteration of it. Definitely something that would provide you a lot more insight, which tells you the product was launched on 3rd March. We have 10 users. This is about 95% of the adoption that we had hoped for. And of all the users who adopted this, we have an average rating of 4.5. Quickly tells you exactly what's happening, gives you all the insight, and they will then be able to ask you more meaningful questions based off this. Finally, how you can use data to gain respect within engineering within your team. What I see with regard to data is a lot of PMs put in a lot of what I call as lazy data requirements. For example, in the product that I used to work for, performance was an huge bottleneck. Customers used to complain about performance all the time. The product manager had did a great job. He factored in what performance meant. For example, he factored them into multiple attributes like install time, boot time of the machine, the time taken for a browser to launch, application launch, so on and so forth. But then he should have gone deeper and understood which of these metrics have an impact on performance the most and what the improvements need to be. The lazy requirement that was given in this case was these are the metrics, these are the factors, just make everything 20% faster. Why should everything be 20% faster? There's no real answer. This was just a finger in the air. Well, faster is better for customers, so just make it faster. And when you have lazy requirements like this, it defeats the purpose because you have put in so much effort trying to understand the factors of performance, and then you just spoil the whole thing by saying just make everything 20% faster. A better way around this would have been to, for example, understand which of these factors are critical. For example, we know that install time happens just once every 6 months or once every year, right? And even if install time is longer, slightly longer, customers are okay as long as the install is successful. They are more unhappy if the install fails than the time taken to install. So it's not such a critical factor. Machine boot time, for example, I boot my machine maybe once a day, once a week, critical enough. But the most critical here is application launch and browser launch, because I launch my browser all the time. I open tabs within my browser on that all the time. I launch applications all the time. I don't want this performance to be adversely impacted by the application that's been installed. So it would be more critical to categorize them as browser and application launch being the critical parameters here, and what their performance increase needs to be based on user behavior that we see, than just putting in a lazy requirement saying make it 20% faster. Just something to watch out for when you're speaking to engineering, and when you speak with regard to data, make sure that you don't have data just because data is what you are supposed to have there, but make sure that you have data that's meaningful and maps back to what your customers actually need, and that would be most useful for your customer, for your engineers to execute. Last but not the least, when you're collecting data, please be very, very cognizant about what kind of data is being collected. This holds true for both consumer and enterprise business. When you're collecting potentially identifiable information, users are very sensitive about how data gets collected. You might argue all you need that you don't look at the data. It's an machine learning algorithm in the backend that's looking at the data, but users don't care. They think you have the data. So you need to have a real justification as to how why you need the data, how you use the data on top of it. And second, you need to be very aware of where you're operating, where the data gets stored, where your users are from, and what kind of data laws apply for you. Now, I'm not suggesting that you need to be an expert in all of the data laws, but for sure you need to work with your legal and engineering team to make sure that you understand what data laws are in place and how you comply with each and every one of them, so that you don't inadvertently break any rule, because that would almost be an existential threat both for your product and for your organization as well, potentially. So these were some of the key takeaways that I have had in terms of data over the years. Again, I know that this is very short time, and I've tried to cover what I thought were critical over 20 to 30 minutes. And I hope to get to deep dive on each one of this topic with you sometime in the future. And again, thank you so much for your time. I'm really appreciative of the fact that I get to speak with you on this. Thank you.